Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Bassam Haddad, and this is a Flow Podcast, episode 6. And we are delighted to have with us Professor Kali Rubaii addressing the cost of imperial warfare on Iraq's environment. I will say a few things about Kali in just a second. I just want to share that this event is this particular podcast is part of the larger project on Iraq 2023, the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, which is co-sponsored with Georgetown University, specifically the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies, as well as the Middle East and Islamic Studies program at George Mason University and the Arab Studies Institute. We have with us here Kali Rubaii, who is a fierce scholar, not just an analyst of the first rate. And we are very excited that you are with us, Kali. How are you?
I'm doing okay. Thanks for having me.
Welcome to Flow podcast. It's episode 6, and we are going to address this pretty, I guess, horrible anniversary, but we are excited to do it. So I don't know, it's like mixed feelings. I'll do it this time. We'll start with the quick intro. Kali, I usually start by sharing your or the bio of the guest, and I would like to say that there's a lot more, but I will share the basics regarding Kali's history and experience. But I would love to hear more from you, Kali, as well as to what you have been doing and what you are up to. Let me just share or start by saying that Kali is assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at Purdue University. She is interested in sharpening resistance strategy that target the vulnerable nexus between coercive power and the physical world. She is currently concluding 2 ethnographic projects. One, taking toxicity as an analytic for material politics. She is working with a team of doctors, epidemiologists, and okay, epidemiol. All right, that's not good.
Epidemiologist.
Epidemiologists. It's the I that kind of messed me up. Epidemiologists and environmental activists to document the links between the epidemic of birth defects in Fallujah and military environmental damage. She is also researching the corporate military enterprise of concrete production in post-invasion Iraq and how it enforces global regimes of class and citizenship. Before we proceed, Kali, I would like to ask you the very basic questions. How have you been doing in general? How are you feeling? And given this anniversary, how are you taking it?
It's a great question. And as we've discussed before, it's always hard to know how to position myself with multiple identities. But my sense right now is that this is a moment when a lot of media production is going to set the record and the archive. And one of my greatest fears is that archive is going to tell a narrative of how terrible the invasion was. It was a terrible mistake, but that the real problem started when the Americans left and the Iraqis were left to their own devices, and that the responsibility for what has taken place since the US invasion is going to be placed in the wrong hands. And so I'm really driven by both fear and anger right now.
Kali, can we start with a very basic question about how veteran injury has been at the center of 20th anniversary discussions? If you can just expand on that, and then I actually have so many questions, and I know that you and I talked about a few things, and I got some leads from you because you have been doing field research as well, as opposed to so many of us who are like speaking from afar. But if we can start with this question on veteran injury.
Sure. I returned from a gathering of military veterans and generals who were reflecting on lessons learned from the invasion in 2003. And I was struck by how there was absolutely no mention of Iraqi people as people by any of the speakers. And I was reminding people there that acknowledging the harm that anyone witnesses in war or that we all face because of warfare doesn't get diminished by acknowledging that the US military did extensive harm in Iraq. The suffering of Iraqis is undeniably greater than that of Americans, and that the centering of oneself or emotions or intentions is wildly insulting to those who are right now in Iraq facing ongoing material and structural harm. At this event, and among others that I'm hearing about in the news and in the New York Times, there's mention of the 7,000 Americans who died in Iraq, and almost no mention of the 300,000 to a million Iraqis who died. So even without any critical analysis, this is a quantifiable inequality, and it has to be named. I think I'm struck by the role that this plays, the role of veteran suffering as part of the Imperial alibi. My friend Corey Peterson Smith reminded me that this is exactly what James Baldwin was talking about when he said that white people, even being around Black people, let alone hearing from them, it becomes impossible to deny the truth and terror of systemic racism because they have the receipts. And I think there's a real aversion right now to hearing from Iraq or those in Iraq because Iraqis have the receipts, and the claim that this was a war for democracy or that Americans are the biggest victims of it can't stand with the receipts that Iraqi people are holding. This was a volunteer military, not a draft. This was a war for profit that dramatically increased the waste tonnage that was exposing Iraqi people. So all those flat screen TVs that were in forward operating bases and made them comfortable, made the air more toxic when they got burned. And we talk about corporate profit, but those corporations continue to profit from massive consumption and destruction. And many of us have our retirement funds invested in those very corporations. So if you have a retirement fund that has a Raytheon stock, you're complicit too. So what we need to be asking right now on the 20th anniversary isn't just what went wrong, what should have been done differently, what should never have been done, but actually thinking about what we want US-Iraq relations to be over the next 20 or 50 years. Do we want it to begin with a self-centered narrative of how hard it is for Americans and allies to occupy other people's homelands? Or do we want it to begin with a really clear-eyed acknowledgement that this was an illegal occupation that cost hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives and continues to have lethal effects? And I think the reason I am interested in the veteran experience as it's packaged with the Iraqi experience is that something like the PACT Act, which is when US soldiers and contractors lobbied for care because of their toxic exposure to waste management during the occupation, is that it's an opportunity to address that unevenness of violence, and particularly when it comes to environmental exposure. So American contractors and soldiers saw acute short-term exposure in the prime of their lives to military burn pits. And Iraqi communities who were downwind faced long-term diffuse exposures from cradle to grave. And this allows an entry point to talk about those inequalities and actually reconcile with what that means.
Thanks, Kali. I would like to ask you about the burn pits. As an analytic, how did they get to be such a focus, and why are they useful and problematic at the same time as analytical objects? And please feel free to address points that I have not shared as part of my question, given your actual experience and knowledge. So, would love to hear about that first, and then I have quite a few other questions as well.
Sure. So burn pits are continuing to be at the forefront of American experience of understanding how militarism and war are bad for the environment. And that's important. So these were US military burn pits. Basically, any occupying military force has to burn its waste. And in this case, they were lit with jet fuel and set on fire. This was over 10, 15 years. The trouble with burn pits as an analytic is that they're just figures. And when we treat them like the thing itself or the problem itself, rather than a signal of the bigger problem, which is occupation, there's often this move to fix the thing itself. So, for example, I hear people say, if only KBR, the private contractor that managed burn pits, had done it better or cleaner, or if only we had done war with more cultural awareness, if we had done imperialism light. These are all questions that are about, these are not abolitionist questions. Essentially, they're saying, how can we do a terrible thing like occupy other people's countries better? Rather than how can we not do war in the first place? So for a country like the US, whose economy is centered on militarism, that kind of abolitionist question means deep reflection on the state of labor, the political power of corporate lobbies, election processes, the meaning of citizenship and who counts. And then, of course, there are always the questions of budgetary allocations, foreign policy, environmental protection. So asking how can we not do war as a modus operandi is a much harder question to ask. And when we follow a single chemical or an object, like a burn pit, there's the risk of missing the toxic relationships that cause people to be exposed to these substances in the first place. One of the things that comes up with burn pits is what counts as a burn pit. And I would argue this is a moot point. The burn pits in Iraq and Afghanistan were bigger than usual because there was a corporate incentive to consume more and burn more. But all military occupations burn trash, and the occupation itself should be our toxic object of analysis. And that said, burn pits are still an environmental feature on Iraq's landscape, so I don't mean to diminish them as just a figure or just a symbol. Their role now is in the form of a scar. So during my last trip to Iraq just a couple weeks ago, I met with a family that was growing grass crops for feeding their livestock. And their land is just a few miles downwind from where Camp Fallujah had a burn pit years ago. And when this family came and went during various military battles, they spent a lot of years with smoke as the backdrop of their environment. And they referred to the burn pit as sometimes changing, but always there, kind of like the weather. And Khalid, that's a pseudonym for a woman I've gotten to know quite well, she was 18 years old and a newlywed during the US invasion. And she had a lot of reproductive health issues that she attributes to the burn pit. She had 2 healthy children, but then she had multiple miscarriages, 2 stillbirths, and then she had 2 live births to children who were born with anencephaly, which means they didn't have a brain. And each of those died just a few hours after birth. Her husband, Abu Khalid, remembers being dizzy and seeing what he called burning air, blurry air that smelled like gasoline when he was working on the farm, which is part of why they're only growing grass now. Nothing was thriving. So now they're in their 40s and they've had to change their farming practices completely. This is one family among many that told me all of their chickens get sick now. It doesn't matter if they bring in new chickens or not. When they feed from the land downwind of where the burn pit was, the chickens grow tumors. They have trouble keeping their feathers on. And while we were meeting, some of the children were filtering in and out from the neighborhood. Some of them were cousins, some friends, and they all had these deep rattling coughs. And Abu Khalid himself was diagnosed with cancer 2 years ago. He was lucky to get enough funding for an early intervention, and I think he'll probably be okay. But his main concern after this litany of health crises that his family was elaborating was that the value of his land had been driven down by the burn pit's legacy. So they would really like to move. But he said, who would ever buy this land? Like, we're stuck here because everyone knows that burn pits have poisoned the land. So on the one hand, burn pits are a very real material consequence in people's lives. But generally, they're a drop in the bucket of people's concerns in Iraq, even if they continue to poison people's bodies and land. They're just not special because there are so many things that the US did to Iraq. And when it comes to health harms, especially, the slow violence people experience from things like burn pits are always less scary than what the military might call kinetic violence, but what most of us would call getting bombed or shot or crushed. And when we talk about burn pits, and this is where I think they're very useful, the thing that makes them military-grade toxic are the kinds of materials they burned. And those materials cause violence all along the chain of supply. That's why I'm really interested in looking at where military coercion actually meets the material world. I went to Congo last year with a colleague, and that's where a lot of the minerals that are used in contemporary warfare are being mined, and then they're ending up in these burn pits. And I learned there that the miners are way less concerned about cancer or birth defects or these chemotoxic exposures, and a lot more concerned about kinetic violence. They're afraid of getting crushed in a mine shaft because the working conditions are so poor. So liberal critics of war might be alarmed to have to reconcile that the electronic devices that they're watching this on are going to end up in a burn pit of some kind, probably not a military one. and that the materials that were mined for these electronics are also mined in the same way that uranium was extracted for the bombs that were dropped in Iraq. So we're all complicit, and the bodies that are injured by the project of war aren't just located at the site of battles. James Smith's book, The Eyes of the World, is a great documentation of this. So basically, burn pits are like a receipt. They show the toxic tally of war by aggregating all the material evidence of war as a transnational economic structure. And they help direct us to what kind of policy tasks are at hand when we look at the environmental effects of war.
Callie, you just got back recently from Fallujah. And of course, we have seen after 2005, 2004, 5, 6, for years actually, until probably recently, depending on how people are following, how much they're following the developments. We've seen horrific pictures. We hear that recently things are picking up. There's new construction, that conditions are improving. Can you just give us a picture of what you experienced there and what might be the forecast?
It's a great question. I don't have a forecast, but I think today and this year and the next 20 years is where we can really see the policy legacy of the invasion legible on the landscape. So we are seeing more unity, especially since the 2018 protests. And yet I still hear a lot of fear and suspicion about sectarianism. And I still have trouble getting friends from Baghdad to come to Fallujah because they're afraid. One claim that I hear in the US is that the invasion was bad, but the real problem started with civil war in Iraq. And what that claim forgets is how sectarianism was written into the Iraqi constitution by Paul Bremer in 2005. So that step basically allocated representational power along sectarian lines. In order to participate in that so-called democracy that the US imposed at gunpoint, leadership had to be identified along sectarian and ethnic lines. And so that's how voting worked. And the landscape then was built with T-walls that divided cities in the same way. So it's no wonder that we see a lot of fear and division in Iraq and on the landscape, because of course the public as a collective resource was politically gutted. The policy legacy of the invasion is also evident in Fallujah, the built environment. So the city's main street, which leads up to a brand new shopping mall, recently was paved. There's a lot of quick aesthetic construction in the main downtown and a lot of growth and a lot of money coming in. But then just off the main road where most people live, the reality of privatization is evident. So the roads are too pocked for a sedan to traverse, for example. Like I was in a four-wheel drive car and it still got stuck twice just getting through a normal neighborhood. There's trash, still detritus of war. There are some missile craters, minimal public resource. So yes, things are improving for the wealthy in certain parts of Iraq. And orders 1 through 100 that were written by the US as conditions of withdrawal and a transfer of power privatized every sector of Iraq's economy. So everything from construction to medical care, banking to oil extraction is all about extracting resources from Iraq with none of the benefits being infused back into society. Many of the factories that I visited employ imported labor from other countries. So even if we just look at employment, we can see that the seeds of public divestment were written into the practices and policies that the US imposed. And now, after 20 years, that's entrenched in the landscape. So as people are talking about corruption in Iraq as a major cause of despair, it's certainly entrenched now. We can't de-link this from the formal policies that gutted Iraq's public sector. This is basically what corruption looks like. In an Anbar province, people are having to use personal filters for air and water. They're having to burn diesel generators for electricity because the public infrastructure was never restored. And these are the receipts I'm talking about. The actual financial cost to every family for a lack of a public sector is directly linked to the invasion.
We're going to take a brief break and really brief and then come back. Thanks, Callie. We have a few images that are yours, I presume. Is this a good time to go through some of them and have you share with us what they might be?
Great.
All right, here we go. So we have
This is
this one, and let me
this is
just.
the tap water in Fallujah where I was living. You can see that it's brown. So most people are having to filter their water.
Should I get close?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a green bucket, so it's a bit tricky, but essentially the water has a lot of grit inside of it. It's not being filtered.
All right.
This is the tea wall industry, still alive and well. So, in spite of tea walls being less prolific than when US military bases were using them, they're now extending into the private and public sector. So, a lot of factories are guarding them. This is up in Kurdistan, and these tea walls were on order by a US consulate. This is the archive that I'm seeing in Iraq. You'll see above this man is a bomb crater. He was in the house when it was destroyed. This was a bomb that was launched, or a missile that was launched by Iraqi forces using American sold F 16s to get ISIS out of this village that I'll leave unnamed for privacy. But something I've noticed is people are repairing is they don't want to erase the history. And so this family has intentionally left this bomb crater visible, and they intend to leave it that way so that they can remember and teach their children about their history. This is a farm where an Anbari farmer has plowed the field. He's going to replant the dates. You can see the one in the foreground has mostly died. It's not doing very well. And in the very back, he's starting to tend to them. The kind of restoration farmers have to go through is intense, especially after periods of displacement. But farmers are also facing a tremendous amount of governmental neglect because of orders like 81 and other privatization policies. They're not really able to contend with the transnational market that they've been opened up to. So what this means is they're relying on heavy chemical inputs in order to keep up with the competing markets. And they're taking a lot of risk because when a crop fails, they don't have government support. And finally, Iraq has seen widespread deforestation. I think some statistics say almost half of Iraq's date palms have disappeared, which then increase windstorms and sandstorms. So it's become a cataclysm of climate change. This is water testing in Colfax, Louisiana. In following the chain of supply, I also went to Colfax, Louisiana, which is a place where Camp Menin and other military training centers burn their waste in another burn pit and basically explode undetonated and unused ordnances. This is where the Colfax massacre took place, where extensive environmental racism continues. And this is where we're taking a look at the seepage of toxic chemicals into the community. This is a mass grave of mostly unknown dead from the 2004 battle. And these are American killed civilians of Fallujah. And this is right along the highway. So again, in spite of a lack of documented archive that is desperately needed, people are finding ways to continue to remember and commemorate the survival and the deaths of people who have endured US militarism.
I'm sorry that we are. I guess I'm going through these in a way that is in a sort of a robotic way. I just we have quite a bit, and we wanted to go through them. We have a
Yeah.
couple more. Let me. All right. Let me.
These are the mines in Kolwezi in Congo. This is what the landscape looks like before the bombs are detonated. And I would say this is also a warscape. If we understand war as an organized economic structure that is meant to endure, and we understand battles as just the fruiting body of war, then we can better interrupt the supply chains that contaminate places like Colfax or Congo. The kinds of deaths that count are always limited to battle periods. And I think extending that and understanding war as a structure is what this picture is meant to do. So I'll talk a minute about what it looks like to contend with war waste. You'll see in the very back, there's a woman walking down the road, and that woman is breathing the detritus of destroyed, mostly bombed buildings that are being cleaned up. This is what cleanup looks like. It's not green. Recycling scrap metal and rebuilding houses is by no means a clean model, and a lot of this would probably be better, or less toxic at least, left just sitting. But the reality is people are rebuilding. And one of the patterns that I've noticed, I don't have enough analysis to say this is statistically significant, but of the families that are suffering from congenital anomalies when they give birth, a lot of them are construction workers, and they often tell a story about how the most dangerous thing you can do is return home, because people are returning home to houses that have been bombed or burned. And then construction workers are particularly active in rebuilding, which means demolishing these buildings, cleaning them, inhaling all of the war detritus, whether that's the metallics left behind from a missile or just the burned curtains that are also toxic. And then they're compiling it and consolidating it, managing the waste as efficiently as possible. And as you can see, the woman walking down the road is breathing directly all of the fumes of that post-war deconstruction. So as I follow the chain of supply from Congo all the way to the burn pits, I noticed over the last year and a half a relatively new phenomenon, which is that all of the broken down cars and old tank sidings, and as you can see here, missile shells are getting recycled. And by recycle, I don't mean like in a green way. I mean that poor individuals, mostly from the South, are gathering large trucks full of scrap metal, and they're shipping them up further north where they're being processed. And what's happening right now in Bazian Valley and in other locations in Iraqi Kurdistan are that steel factories are, rather than producing high quality, flexible steel that might survive something like the earthquake that was so devastating just a few weeks ago, they're producing relatively cheap steel from recycled remnants. And there's a preference in these factories for heavy metals, which means that bombs and bomb fragments and even bullets are preferred. So these are getting melted down, and as you can see, the ceiling of this building is pocked with explosions, tiny explosions. When I was there was in the news an entire factory exploded because some of the ordnances haven't been detonated yet, and they're all getting thrown in here and recycled, so to speak, or reused. And they're building the rebar for the concrete construction. Something that's important to notice here is that all of the labor at this factory is imported labor from India or China, and very disenfranchised people who are experiencing their own labor exploitation and their own exposure. But it's also reflective of the privatization of Iraq's industries. The construction industry, for example, is not required to employ Iraqi people. And there's an incentive not to, because they cost more and there's more political accountability to people who are not displaced. This factory is also just upstream and just above one of Iraq's largest freshwater aquifers. And it's also in a valley where farmers are growing a lot of food. So contamination is now being remetabolized into Iraq's environment. And there's a second wave of toxic exposure because, of course, these bombs are being redetonated and turned into concrete structures.
I think we have. Yeah.
This is a picture just outside of Fallujah, closer to the village of Garma. And you can see that there is a tree trying to grow on the side of the road, but in the back is a big concrete factory that is part of the post-war rebuilding effort. It's never a clean energy project. Rebuilding from mass destruction is often just as bad for the environment as the destruction itself. So when we see the good news that, Fallujah, for example, is seeing rapid development, that's great. But the speed of construction and the rate of destruction that's required to have post-war development is extensive. And the kind of environmental damage it causes is unnecessarily harmful. This is Fallujah Hospital. I'll just take a moment here to say that this is Fallujah Women and Children's Hospital, and this is the site of a lot of my research. In Fallujah, especially, the epidemic of birth defects remains this important figure of intergenerational impacts of US invasion. So if burn pits represent toxic exposure to American soldiers, birth defects have that same symbolic weight among families, especially women who are facing risky pregnancies and early infant death. And then, of course, a lot of them are dealing with unsupported caretaking for children who face lifelong disabilities in a place where there is not as much infrastructural support. Making new lives is one of the ways people are resisting and outlasting occupation. And so the production of new lives being distorted or dismembered is incredibly painful. Even though there are other health concerns that are far more prevalent, birth defects are discussed frequently in Iraq. And I think that this is because the bodies of children are forming part of that archive of generations deep violence. So I just met with a wonderful friend, Dr. Firas. He's a cardiologist for children. And he told me this story about what the intergenerational legacy of war is. Basically, there was a child born with a heart defect. It was repairable but serious, and the baby had some complications. So he sent the child home with her father, knowing that she could have a corrective surgery that would allow her to survive. And then he went on this massive hunt. This is kind of part of a doctor's life in Iraq, hunting for the supplies that he needed. So he found the tubing, he found some of the surgical supplies, some he had to buy himself because the hospital didn't provide them. And he was just missing this one little plastic piece that was required for the surgery. And meanwhile, this child's waiting at home with very limited number of days that she can wait. And so the father comes in to meet with the doctor, and he goes over the procedure plan, and he explains exactly what to expect for the daughter's surgery and the recovery process, that he's just waiting on this one little piece. And he talks for about 10 minutes, and then the father stops him and says, "I'm sorry, doctor, but she died." So without equipped hospitals, completely treatable health concerns are lethal. And for children who are born today, the war on terror isn't 20 years old. It starts today. And it would be so easy to read the consequences of US occupation as distant or detached from the 2003 invasion. But the physical materials that are in burn pits or in hospitals, or their lack, isn't a story of slow violence. This is a story of incessant intergenerational violence that reflects this extremely toxic relationship between US empire and Iraqi people that are inhaling the trash of our wars every day. So I think the next picture you have is the back of this hospital, which would help to explain exactly why supplies are so limited. This is a public hospital, and so it doesn't have the resources that a private one would. And what happened for this hospital is that all of the rubble from the most recent bombing is just piled in the back, as are many of the machines that no longer work. Okay, well, this is a field where a family is basically grazing sheep on grass, and you can see the waterways that they're repairing. Essentially, what's going on here is that they are continuing to grow food in spite of a lack of support, many disruptions to fuel costs, cuts to supply chains, lack of support for when farmers take risks on certain crops mean that farmers in Anbar province especially are essentially leading the future in creative farming practices that are going to keep people alive as we see climate change affecting communities differently. So this is the farm of a family outside of Rubaii. And what they're doing is they're trying a new kind of crop rotation. So you'll see sheep grazing right now. And what they're going to do is they're going to try and plant different crops because they can't afford a greenhouse, which would help manage the drought conditions that they're experiencing. I hear people say this often, and I agree. Iraq was not bombed into the Stone Ages. It was bombed into the future. And even if people don't care about Iraqi people or Iraq the place, which they should, the ways that people are making new lives on these blasted landscape is a model for how people are going to survive climate change disasters, right? This requires a high degree of flexibility and creativity. So if you want to know how to survive I say look to Umbari farmers, especially this family. They've tried all kinds of organic solutions to try and limit their chemical inputs, and they're also trying to find creative solutions to manage the drought and dust storms that they're experiencing all the time. This is in Bazion Valley. This is a concrete factory in the back, or a cement factory in the back. But the steel factory is where the horse is facing. And this is one of many animals and children that are facing lung conditions from recent unregulated or underregulated industry. But you can also see the horse is quite disturbed by the noise pollution, which has basically sent away all bird life. And these factories are running 24/7. And then the farming and herding communities that are trying to manage the production of new lives on this landscape are being driven into the cities because they just can't tolerate the noise pollution, let alone the chronic coughs. Many of the farmers here are Kurdish farmers who have tried to sell their land for very cheap because, of course, it's been devalued. And they're still maintaining their farms. And then the refugees that came in, or the internally displaced people that came in from other parts of Iraq at earlier stages, are now working as essentially sharecroppers, very low paid labor. Many are from Anbar province, who are working the land and tolerating the health conditions. So we have yet another microcosm of labor reallocation and exploitation that's a result of orders and policies that deregulate the public sector and actually protect both labor and environment.
All right, I think we've exhausted you enough with the pictures. Let me just share that I am in awe of all the work that you have done, and happy to happy to actually do another conversation if you are available down the line to do an update and talk more about a number of things. But before I let you go, and I know you've said quite a bit about the rural areas, but based on your work in the rural areas, is there, especially with farmers, can you just share more, if possible, on the conditions of these areas based on your experience that you haven't already shared as you address the pictures?
Sure. I'll just say a few final things. One is that a greenhouse farmer told me that, I'm not sure if the statistic is true or not, but it's certainly the perception that Iraq grew 90% of its own tomatoes before 2003, and now it grows only 10% of its own tomatoes. This statistic is significant not because Iraq should necessarily be growing all of its own tomatoes, but it does speak to the vulnerability that people are now experiencing under sanctions. In spite of the incredible violence that sanctions imposed on people, there was some degree of food sovereignty that farmers, and especially people in rural areas, experienced, where they were actually producing enough food to survive, even if it was minimally. And now there's a lot of transnational dependency that makes Iraqi communities, especially rural communities, more vulnerable to market fluctuation, market shock, the kind of neoliberal policies that are threatening a lot of people's lives. I'll also say that someone asked me what has changed most in Iraq over the last 10 years of my visiting, and I said air quality. And that's not just because of these chemical inputs from things like burn pits and waste management and construction and the oil industry. It's also because of deforestation. And so those farmers that are actively trying to farm are having to do a lot of work to constantly repair. So they're wiping off soot and oil from tree leaves, and they're trying all these creative strategies. And essentially, I think the rural communities are ultimately the leaders of what survival looks like in Iraq, because they really are making it possible to grow food and make new life.
I I have to do this at least once every conversation, which is forget the mute button. Is there anything else that you'd like? Thank you. I said thank you, and I asked if there's anything else you'd like to address before we let you go. I know you have a very busy schedule, not least this week. Maybe you can leave us with, what's next, what to do, what can be done, what can people listening. I know people are angry, frustrated, not just about what's happening in Iraq, but also about how people in this country, in the United States, some people at least are talking about Iraq, but also primarily about what is happening in Iraq, and of course the Iraqis themselves are, you know, from me following what is happening in Iraq. I mean, there's a huge array of like different viewpoints also on everything that has happened. And as you know, we were we entered Iraq like directly after the invasion in 2003, and made a film which we will be featuring in the one-day conference at Georgetown University about Baghdad. And even then, I mean, literally right after the invasion, of course, the diversity of opinions was great, but there was not much diversity when it came to people's views of what the U.S. is likely to do in the long term, or whether it did this on principle or otherwise. There was not much diversity there, but in all cases, what can be done, what to do, what's next, based on everything that you have gathered. And
Yeah,
I know that's not a fair question.
it's so unfair, but I guess I'll mostly address this to US or British or the allied audiences. Um, the US owes Iraq reparations. And there are three components. This is like, reparations 101. The first step is acknowledge harm and take responsibility. And that means public, personal, loud apology with no caveats. So, for every questioning veteran, like get on YouTube and say it. And the power of saying those words is not so much that it does anything for Iraqi people, but that it identifies a truth that could otherwise be left as an open secret. And that matters. And I include all of us, right? A lot of us fall into the Brown alibi or the injury alibi. And what I mean by this is that just because we are all also victims of US empire, or that our families were displaced by it, or that we were injured by it, it doesn't mean we're not complicit or beneficiaries. And that's what complicity is, right? It's when an empire distributes burdens onto everyone, including moral burdens. And then there are incentives to protest less the more you benefit. So owning Americanness or Britishness or complicity really requires us to cope with cognitive dissonance and actually name and identify violence against Iraq. And then the second step is reparations, which is redistributing the pillaged resources. And in this case, that means both supporting grassroots Iraqi-led repair efforts. There are lots of really great people who are working on environmental protection and repair, women's rights, democratization, ousting corruption. But it also could include a call for formal reparations by the US to Iraq. In many of my interviews with families talking about exposure, they were able to identify a very clear list of property damages that they incurred from US forces. It would not be difficult to compensate people for their property loss, even if their life and livelihood is irreparably damaged or for lost lives. So that's a question of political will. And then finally, there's the prevention method, which is we have to be braver about the US political landscape. We have to fight harder for ending militarism, right? Like, even if you don't care about other people, identifying militarism as a causal factor for climate change, racial capitalism, gender inequality prevents us from being slaughtered by those very, so-called solutions. So, just for an example, those of us who are experts on the effects of militarism or the terrorism label in the Middle East, we're well positioned to actively confront the terrorism charges against mostly Black and brown protesters in Cop City in Atlanta, who are people trying to stop the leveling of a forest to build a major training ground for militarized police. This is the kind of training ground that's fueling the next decade of the war on terror. These are people who are going to be deployed to Somalia or Chicago. So identifying Iraq as a place that has witnessed decades of US foreign policy, we can look to Iraqi people or scholars of Iraq who know very well what it means to survive these invasive, pernicious ways that the war on terror has leaked into daily life and rippled across generations. And in this case, it's our role to be good followers. And being a good follower means lending our support and our resources and our voices to the leaders of Iraq's next generation, and particularly those farmers I talked about, who are really in a way, the most politically active by doing material work on the ground.
Thanks very much, Callie. This has been a very insightful and powerful set of insights. I really and experiences. I really appreciate all the work that you have done, and we all do. And thanks for sharing it with us and for taking the risks that you did in order to look into and investigate these matters. I know this is not a finite context. This will go on, and I hope it moves in directions where less and less people are affected. We hope to see you again. I always say, hopefully, under better circumstances. I've been saying this for many, many years, and for some reason, it doesn't always work out that way. But I thank you again for joining us, and will leave you with the last word, unless you're ready to move on to. I know you have something coming up right after this, so I'll leave you with the last word, and then I will let you go.
I do. I have to go, but thank you so much for hosting me, and thank you for having events like this where we can actually, think critically and discuss this. It's really,
Thanks.
really important.
Thank you, and have a wonderful day. I'm going to say just a quick word that on March 31st at Georgetown University, we are holding an all-day conference, starting with a panel on the situation in Iraq in general, like broadly speaking, and then another panel on culture and what have Iraqis been doing in the context and realm of culture since the invasion, especially recently, where there are remarkable developments in that regard. And then we are actually screening about Baghdad, which will also include an announcement about making the film open source. But everyone is invited to the conference, and you can find more information either on Jadaliyya or on the Center for Contemporary Arab Studies website. All right. Thanks, Kali. Good luck with your future endeavors, and hope to see you again.
Thank you so much, Bassam.
Take care.